My family has a terrible curse that causes me to live in constant anxiety. We're butchers. We don't run a national corporation for it or anything, but our quality has always been impeccable. 5-star Google reviews, top of the word of mouth. We probably even have Michelin star if it was possible for places other than restaurants. Somehow we have been able to produce the most delicious soft mouth melting meats, better than the Wagyu beef. But the story for how this came to be and how it is not a happy-go-lucky as our service. My family have been butchers for hundreds of years. Even our last name is Butcher, and somehow have not changed professions since that was given. Let me clarify that this is my story and my explanation as for why I wish I was dead yet, and I don't want to die. But I must tell this story of my ancestor. I'm not even sure exactly how long ago this was, but the story goes that it was during the medieval ages. His father and grandfather always kept the honesty as the shop's top moral framework. Because of this, they were often up at the choice of meat shop for even lords and ladies of nearby lands, until one day, when a new shop opened up. My ancestors were not worried, because their shop was so successful. This shop didn't even make a sale for days. However, on a day no special than the other, the town drunk somehow found himself on the other side of the shop, thinking it was my ancestors' family shop. He ordered to cut off the leg meat, drunkenly staggered it to home, and fell into a booze-induced slumber. The next day he cooked the meat, ate it, and it came running into town, directly into our shop. He asked what he had in order in his drunken stupor, as it was most saliva-tasting, most delectable meat he had ever eaten. The family had told him that he did not visit the shop yesterday at all. They all realized that it must have been another shop by mistake, and my family said there was no way that it could have been the other shop, so they all went over as a group, my grandfather, father, son, and drunk. They all asked the shopkeeper on what was order, and they simply gestured for the stack of cubed meat on display with furrowed brows. My family had purchased a cube and immediately went back to cook it. And after doing so, the way they would cook in their own product, the meat cooked was placed on the tongues. Within seconds, they soon realized that they had to keep their other shop's meat secret to the rest of the town. They told the drunk that he must never tell anybody about the other shop's quality of meat, and the promised not to. But drunk would you not be drunk, even if they did yell? All the secret entire town would be blinded by the booze. It did not take long for people to hear about the shop and its marvelous taste in meat. My ancestor's butcher shop was in danger of closing within weeks. The son could not stand to see his family go in such a low point, and being that the youngest at 16, he wanted to prove that he was helpful to the family. He began spying on the other shopkeepers, in hopes of figuring out their secret to the delicious cubes. Their methods, from what the son could soon see, they all seemed normal. But every weekend, they would take their wagon out of town. The son was not sure where, as he was not able to stealthily follow beyond the trees and buildings. When he asked for his father and grandfather for permission to follow, and was firmly told no, that doing so would be a terrible thing, and what they the honest people, and that God would help them eventually. God did not. Another week later, the father grew ill. Without his labor, the shop was even more or less profitable, and could not afford the things needed to get him better: food, medicine, and time. The son could not bear it. That weekend there was a new moon. It was the best opportunity for him to sneak into the wagon. The dark of the night, he endured the long bumpy ride in his wooden cage until they had arrived. As soon as the wagon stopped, voices could soon be heard, but it was indiscernible as to what they were saying. The son peeked out of the cover and saw two figures heading into a building. All became quiet. He slipped out of the wagon and made his way inside. as slyly as he could, into the same building. Inside, he saw two figures carrying a bloody wrapping of meat. Finally, the son had discovered the source of the delicious carcasses and the shopkeeper's supplier. Two of the figures repeated this several times, and when the only figure returned inside, he knew he had to get back in the wagon before it took off to his hometown. Just as he exited out of the building, the horses began trotting. He sprinted as fast as he could, the sound of his footsteps ridden by the horses, and jumped into the wagon right before his leg muscles would reach their physical limit. The ride back was not bumpy. He did feel as if he was in a wooden cage anymore, but of a bed of gold. When they had finally made their way home, he wrapped a leg and a limb in his shirt, climbed out of the opposite shopkeeper, and quickly made his way home. He let out a shout of joy when he entered his home. It was a shout that his entire family had heard, which caused them to gather. He told them about his story, showed the wrapped up meat. Although his grandfather was entirely not on board, his sister and mother were jumping for joy. They knew this was meant for a good future for them all, and all they could really afford was the father's care. The son quickly unwrapped his treasure, and the caliphony of joy had ended. The son not only grabbed a leg of lamb, but a human limb. His grandfather immediately yelled at him what he had just brought into their house. He took the meat and went to start a fire outside in order to burn the meat before anyone else found out about it. His sister comforted their mother, who was crying. The son felt great shame and went to bed. After a long and well needed from his escape pods to his bed before a rest, he woke up to the sounds of people gathering around a busy shop. Their own. He asked at what had happened. The family told him they had spoke a great deal after he had gone to sleep. They all decided that they needed to do this, even the grandfather. They cooked the limb, and after trying some of the forbidden meat, called in a favor to the test lords, and they had previously sold to. This piece of meat was given to the king, and the word had spread quickly. Their shop had meat that the king himself had put his orders in for. They had been the king's favorite supplier. My father stopped the story at some point. I thought of it was strange, but simply a folk tale, the family legend. He then showed me something I never thought would have imagined, and what he would work on that very morning. While I was asleep, he had done an excellent job to never reveal the family secret. Every morning, before the street animals would wake, my father would chop, skin, flelt, boil, and prepare various pieces of flesh, human meat. I was sick, felt as if I were to blame. He needed to continue this horrible tradition. He needed to kill people for my sake, to pay for my tuition, for the constant medical bills, to make sure we stayed healthy, to pay every other bill that we needed to live. I couldn't take this burden. I couldn't take the fact that my father was the murderer. I panicked and ran away. When I saw my dad next, I wanted to hear the rest of the story, although my dad was a killer. I knew it wouldn't kill me because I was in the reason for doing so in the first place. He was paying for us to have a good life. He continued the story, and here's the important part. The grandfather, in order to meet the demands of the new meat shop, the other shopkeeper had explained his situation. He apologized for what the son had done, but insisted that he needed to success to the supplier. He wouldn't ask for the supplier for such fresh bodies, and he even would cut in the scales shopkeeper for a 50-50 split of the money. He's explained that this was because his son was ill, and they needed to afford the medical bills and supplies. Even with the 50-50 split, they would be able to afford it, all thanks to the new demand. The shopkeeper was firm in their denial for his request. The grandfather persisted, explained how they absolutely needed this to help his son, who is the main laborer of the family. The shopkeeper once again disagreed. The grandfather explained and asked if he could purchase all of the stock of the shopkeeper had right then and there. The shopkeeper denied any sale to him. In his desperation, he pushed the shopkeeper out of the way. He must have been a very strong man, or perhaps a very desperate, because the shopkeeper was knocked back into the wall, their head striking it with a cracking sound. The grandfather, ignoring this, pushed on his mission, grabbing as many bags of meat as he could carry. As he was carrying them out of the store, the shopkeeper did tell him that for doing this, his wish would be granted. His son would be able to talk and work and provide for the family as long as his age allowed him to do so. The grandfather, after stopping to hear this, he simply turned away and continued the family shop. What our family didn't know about the shopkeeper was that there was a witch, one who had cursed the family in a strange way that didn't manifest until the witch was gone long after. The day the grandfather had stolen the bags of meat, his son miraculously recovered. He went from coughing up blood to having a high fever, chills and aches, no symptoms whatsoever. But what seemed to be a blessing turned out to be a part of the shopkeeper's curse. The father had no symptoms of it either, even the alignment of his entire life, not until he became too old to continue working. The day after he retired, he felt a strange sensation in his throat and began sweating. Mucus began dripping from his nostrils, then pouring. He then began violently coughing blood. It's said to even exclaimed as between gasps of his breath and that his head was on fire, that it felt like his insides were being replaced by thorns, cutting him apart from the inside out. He had died a most violent death. The family speculated that this must have been a witch's curse, based on what the grandfather had told them way back when he took the meat. This was apparently a fitting explanation for the time period. With the death of the father, they began to worry. They wondered too if they were cursed. Ultimately, possibly as a way of easing their racing minds, they decided that there was just the father who this would affect. They believed that the witch's curse was over from his death. It was not. As soon as every person stopped working, they died incredibly and grotesque death. Over the years, they discovered about the curse, that it would happen regardless if the person ever actually retired. Once they reached the retirement age, that they were at the risk of curse giving them a horrific end. It did not matter if they spent their lives working until a certain point or not. Until if they tried to end their lives, the curse would take them even more horrific fashion than others. If they tried to show that this would happen to anyone else, it would take them before they were able to. There was no way to avoid it or show that it existed to those outside the family. It was eventually discovered that the accumulation of the pain throughout the person's life would be affected to 100 unfold onto them whenever the curse was activated. The ancestors who had been injured in what would receive the most extreme, unbearable, searing hot pains would replace, if they were shot or stabbed, those who had only been broken bones of their lives and would feel as if their bones were being on the ground for powder. Any scrapes as if sandpaper was being rubbed over and over onto their open flesh. The only way to avoid this was being seen to those who had simple lives, without much injury or illness. They would not explain such experiments of such a horrible ending. However, easier said than done. To avoid all the injuries, aches, pains, and much more in life, that, on the other hand, is not an easy task. Not a single person of the lineage has died peacefully or on their deathbeds. They have died in the most horrific deaths imaginable, save for the lucky who is able to few and live a sheltered life. My father explained that this is why he had always watched me like a hawk. This is why our medical bills were so high, beyond the average of persons' yearly checkups. He had said that he always tried his best to make sure I was safe and healthy growing up. But what parent doesn't? I didn't realize the gravity of the situation, and he didn't want to scare me as a child or ruin my childhood by living completely sheltered life. This is my way of going back in this. He said that he did his best that he could without jeopardizing the small having a normal life. He didn't want me to live too scared to do anything. Now that I was older and was mature enough, his eyes to understand without completely destroying my worldview. He told me he was wrong. There was no way I would never be okay with this without learning the truth. Of course, he should have foreseen the possible outcomes. This is why I wish I was dead, but I don't want to die. Growing up, I had managed to stay safe and healthy thanks to the precautions, but now death is too painful. Everything I had learned about my family didn't matter to me at this point. I just wished that my dad had told me that before. I didn't want to hear anything he had to say, but I felt like I mentioned before. I had to. It's not like I could wheel on my own bed anyway, much less past the nurses. I already couldn't handle the pain. I wish my attempt was very successful.